Houston Texans are undoubtedly one of the most exciting offenses heading towards the 2024 season, but of course, that excitement comes at a cost in fantasy football. In fact, each of their top 3 wide receivers go off the board in 2024 fantasy football drafts within the first 35 picks. Joe Mixon goes around pick 60, Dalton Schultz goes in the early 100s, and today we're going to answer the question of whether or not we want to smash or pass on the Houston Texans skill players at their respective costs in 2024 fantasy football. Let's talk about it all right here, right now, in episode 23 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. Nico Collins is currently being drafted as Fantasy's wide receiver 14 around pick 19 overall, which is a mid-second round pick. Meanwhile, Stefon Diggs is currently being drafted as Fantasy's wide receiver 21 around pick 29 overall, which is a mid-third round pick. So let's talk about whether or not we want to smash or pass at those respective costs. Last year's Houston Texans were above average in the passing game, finishing 12th in passing attempts, 7th in passing yards, and 12th in passing touchdowns. And that team's success certainly trickled down to the individual level, where guys like Nico Collins had terrific years in fantasy football. Nico Collins finished as Fantasy's wide receiver 12 in 2023, despite finishing 25th among wide receivers in targets. Collins appeared in 15 games, averaging over 7 targets and 17 PPR points per game, a pace that would have made him Fantasy's wide receiver 5 overall had he just played in 17 games. He produced big weeks pretty consistently. He scored 20 or more PPR points more frequently than he scored fewer than 10 PPR points, and he had a week-winning, league-wrecking ceiling, scoring 34 or more PPR points in 3 different games, including a high of 35.8. And in the end, after racking up nearly 1,300 receiving yards, Nico Collins was rewarded with a shiny new contract, signing a 3-year extension worth $73 million, including $52 million guaranteed, making it clear as day that Nico Collins will be a big part of the Houston Texans' plans moving forward. That's the good news. Now, as for the bad news, there's no sugarcoating it. There is cause for pause when it comes to selecting Nico Collins in 2024 fantasy football. For starters, there are a lot of mouths to feed in Houston. There were already a lot of mouths to feed in Houston before they acquired Stefon Diggs. They have Stefon Diggs, Nico Collins, Dell, Dalton Schultz, Joe Mixon, all of which are deserving of touches in this high-powered offense. Now, what's interesting is that last year, in 10 fully healthy games that Dell played, Dell actually had more targets and more touchdowns and more PPR points than Nico Collins did in the first 10 games, the 10 games that Dell was completely healthy. It's at least interesting, if nothing else. Still, Nico Collins did average over 7 targets, over 16 PPR points per game in the 9 full games that Collins, Dell, and Dalton Schultz played together. But again, now they added Stefon Diggs, a guy who's averaging 9.2 targets per game over the last 96 games. That's 5+ seasons of Stefon Diggs averaging over 9 targets per game. It's fair to wonder if Nico Collins' 7.4 targets per game could dip below 7. Also, a red flag for Nico Collins is that despite finishing just 3 yards shy of 1,300 receiving yards last season, Vegas Sportsbooks currently have his over-under for receiving yards set at 950.5. And just for context, 950 receiving yards last year would have ranked 28th among all wide receivers in the NFL. So, the question is, are we smashing or passing on Nico Collins at wide receiver 14, 19th overall, mid-second round pick? We'll talk about it in 1 second, but first, let's talk about Stefon Diggs. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A Forgemaster? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. After spending his first 5 years with the Minnesota Vikings and the last 4 years with the Buffalo Bills, Stefon Diggs is entering year 10 in the NFL, his age 31 season, and he'll be beginning a new chapter in his career, spending it with the high-powered Houston Texans offense. Now, we'll keep Stefon Diggs' portion short. I've already dove way into Stefon Diggs' fit with the Houston Texans in episode 12 of Inside the 20, but TLDR, let's start with the elephant in the room, right? It's no secret that Stefon Diggs alarmingly fell off of a cliff at the tail end of the 2023 season. Over the first 9 games of the year, he was the same old Stefon Diggs that we've all known and loved for years. He averaged nearly 11 targets and nearly 22 PPR points per game over the first 9. But then over the last 10 games, he crashed off that cliff, averaging 8 targets and less than 10 points per game. And again, we've already talked all about this and why that might be in episode 12 of Inside the 20. But ultimately, we explored whether or not his crash off a cliff has to do with age and running out of gas, or more likely, it was the new interim offensive coordinator Joe Brady's fault, who took over as the offensive coordinator in Week 11. Stefon Diggs is just 1 year removed from the second best season of his entire career and 3 straight top 7 finishes in fantasy football. There's plenty of gas left in the tank. That is not the issue moving into 2024. Again, if you want deeper details and analysis regarding Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's outlook on Stefon Diggs' fit with the Houston Texans, you can reference episode 12 at any time. But TLDR, age and running out of gas is not the issue for 2024. The issue is the same as what we see with Nico Collins. It's how many mouths there are to feed in a Houston Texans offense that finished a modest 12th in passing attempts last season. And Vegas sportsbooks are expecting a step back for Stefon Diggs as well. His over-under on receiving yards is currently set at 900.5, despite 6 straight seasons over 1,000 receiving yards. And for context, 900 receiving yards last year would have been good for 31st among all wide receivers. Of course, both Stefon Diggs and Nico Collins, and heck, Tank Dell, Dalton Schultz, everybody could benefit from the Texans ramping up CJ Stroud passing attempts in year 2. They finished a modest 12th in passing attempts last year. There is plenty of room for growth, and the Texans are expected to score plenty of points. They're projected to be the 9th highest scoring team in the NFL. There are fantasy points. There will be fantasy points in 2024, but ultimately the question is, and it's time to answer, are we going to smash or pass on Stefon Diggs and Nico Collins at their current price tags? Ultimately, I am treating both guys as higher end boom or bust type of wide receiver 2s that are going to offer the occasional week winning explosion of 20 or more PPR points, but also the occasional fantasy football dud while they make way for the other guy in the rotation, or Tank Dell or Dalton Schultz and or Joe Mixon. Now, again, don't get me wrong. Stefon Diggs, Nico Collins, both of these guys are going to score fantasy football points, and they are going to have week winning type of performances. But week to week consistency might be hard to come by with so many different mouths to feed, and that makes both guys much better best ball picks where you don't have to predict when they're going to go off or when they're going to bust. It makes them a better best ball pick than it makes them a season-long pick. So, forced to choose smash or pass on their current costs, I'm fine with their costs. I'm just not excited about them. Nico is drafted within the same range as guys like Jonathan Taylor, Chris Olave, Devontae Adams, Brandon Ayuk, Saquon Barkley, Jalen Waddle, Deebo Samuel, etc. Then you got Stefon Diggs, he's drafted in the same range as guys like Devontae Smith, Devon Achane, DJ Moore, Cooper Kupp, DK Metcalf, Kyron Williams, Michael Pittman, and other guys. Push comes to shove, I am more than likely to pass on Nico Collins in the mid-second round because I know that I can instead wait around and smash on Stefon Diggs in the third round. Now that said, it is worth noting that I have seen both Nico Collins and Stefon Diggs in the third round. And when that happens, I choose Nico Collins over Stefon Diggs just to mix up my own portfolio a bit. Now, Basement Brood Fantasy Football's draft guide currently has Nico Collins ranked 23 overall and Stefon Diggs ranked 24 overall. Now, what about that third wide receiver in Houston? Right? Tank Dell, a guy who's already entering his age 25 season, despite it being just year 2 in the NFL. Tank Dell is currently being drafted as Fantasy's wide receiver 26, around pick 35 overall, which is a late third round pick. Are we smashing or passing at that cost? Growing up, one of my favorite things to do was play Madden on my PlayStation, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5. And when I say play Madden, what I really mean is simulate the games and simulate the seasons, because my favorite part was managing the team, scouting prospects, doing the draft, making trades, signing free agents, and everything that goes into managing a football team and leading a franchise to glory, building it from the ground up. And if that's your type of deal, if you love that sort of thing, you're going to absolutely love GM Dynasty, which is a simulated football game that I recently started playing and instantly fell in love with. With realistic game planning mechanics and immersive features, GM Dynasty puts you in the hot seat of sports management. And it's not just a game. It's a simulation of the real deal. I invite you to get your free team and compete in Basement Brood Fantasy Football's upcoming tournament, where there's going to be prizes for whoever wins the thing. Register your account on gmdynasty.com, and when you do, join the Basement Brood Fantasy Football contest using the link that we left for you in the show notes. Tank Dell was undoubtedly one of the most exciting rookies in all of football and all of fantasy football in 2023. He averaged 7+ targets and 16+ PPR points per game in 10 full games as a rookie before he went down with an injury. That was a pace that would have made him Fantasy's wide receiver 8 overall had he played all 17 games. In fact, fun fact, like I mentioned with Nico Collins, Tank Dell actually had more targets than Nico Collins did over their first 10 full games that they played together before Tank Dell got hurt. He had more targets, more touchdowns, and more PPR points. Tank Dell was super efficient. He finished as Fantasy's wide receiver 39, despite appearing in just 11 games and finishing 56th among wide receivers in targets. He scored 15 or more PPR points in 60% of his games, but he was a little bit boom or bust. He scored 20 or more PPR points at the same rate, 40%, that he scored fewer than 9 PPR points. But all in all, great showing for the rookie. Now, the concern with Tank Dell heading into 2024, aside from coming back from a season-ending injury, is the same exact concern that we've already talked about with Stefon Diggs and Nico Collins. There's too many mouths to feed in Houston. In fact, there were already a lot of mouths to feed last year before they acquired Stefon Diggs. Tank Dell was great. He averaged over 16 PPR points per game in the 9 full games that he played together with Nico Collins and Dalton Schultz, but the somewhat scary piece of that is during that process, he averaged less than 7 targets per game. And now we're adding Stefon Diggs to the mix, a guy we've already discussed as averaging over 9 targets per game over the last 5+ seasons. It's fair to wonder if it's possible we see Tank Dell's targets per game dip below 6, which would make him really, really difficult to trust on a week-to-week basis if he's not quite getting the volume that you need to produce on a consistent basis. Now, like those other guys, Tank Dell could certainly benefit from the Houston Texans ramping up passing attempts, an area that there is room for growth after finishing just 12th last year. but that's no sure thing. And even if they do, it's no sure thing those targets would go to Tank Dell as opposed to Stefon Diggs, Nico Collins, and Dalton Schultz. Like those other guys, I am approaching Tank Dell as a higher end wide receiver 3, but he's a guy that I consider boom or bust. I mean, he was already somewhat boom or bust last year, and now when you add Stefon Diggs to the mix, it's hard to picture a scenario where Tank Dell gets enough week-to-week volume to produce at a consistent level. He is going to give you those explosion weeks, but he's going to mix in plenty of duds as well. Just like those other guys, this makes Tank Dell much more intriguing to me in a best ball format as opposed to a season-long format. But still, he is going to get you fantasy points. It's just that if there's one wide receiver that hurts the most from Stefon Diggs coming to town, it's probably Tank Dell. Like the other guys, Tank Dell's cost is perfectly fine. It's not outrageous, but he's also drafted in a very competitive spot near guys like Cooper Kupp, DK Metcalf, Kyron Williams, Michael Pittman, Sam Laporta, Zay Flowers, Travis Kelce, Derrick Henry, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Christian Kirk, and even some more other guys. So if I'm forced to choose smash or pass on Tank Dell at wide receiver 26, around pick 35 overall, unfortunately, I gotta pass on this one in season-long leagues, although I'm okay with taking the occasional flyer in a best ball draft. BBFF's draft guide, by the way, currently has Tank Dell ranked at 39 overall. Basement Brood Fantasy Football's 2024 draft guide is a resource that BBFF subscribers are using to dominate their drafts and get ahead of their league mates before that first football is even kicked in week 1. It contains 300 players, and it's complete with rankings that are going to help with tough decisions, tiers that help you plan for future draft picks, 2024 analysis and previews for all 300 players, stoplights that suggest the perfect time to draft a player, wait for a player, or reach for a player that you absolutely must have on your roster, and an ADP tracker that shows you which direction a player is trending in real drafts over the last several weeks. The draft guide is built and maintained with 30 plus hours of weekly research and over 300 real drafts done by yours truly. It's like you're walking into your fantasy draft having done 300 of your own to prepare. It's $14.99 per year, and you can find it using the link that we left for you in the show notes. All right, what about Joe Mixon, who is joining an ascending Houston Texans offense that finished 13th in scoring last year? Are we smashing or passing on Joe Mixon at RB13 around pick 60 overall, which is right at the 5th and 6th round turn? Now, I'll keep this one short. I already talked in great length about Joe Mixon's fit with the Houston Texans in episode 9 of Basement Brood Fantasy Football, but TLDR, there's no sugarcoating that last year's Houston Texans were not good in the running game. They finished 20th in rushing attempts, 22nd in rushing yards, 23rd in rushing touchdowns, and Devin Singletary finished as fantasy's RB32 despite finishing 21st in the NFL in touches. Not good. Of course, Devin Singletary is not Joe Mixon, and there's a reason that the Houston Texans went out and acquired Mixon services this offseason. Now, Joe Mixon is a career workhorse. The guy's averaging over 19 touches per game in his career. And in 5 of the last 7 seasons, Joe Mixon has been able to accumulate over 270 touches, 1,200 scrimmage yards, 8 or more touchdowns, and he's finished as fantasy's RB14 or better in 5 of the last 7 seasons. And perhaps where the biggest difference between Devin Singletary and Joe Mixon will be felt for the Houston Texans is near the goal line, which is where fantasy points are scored. Last year, Devin Singletary handled just 7 carries inside the 5-yard line, and he was only able to score 1 touchdown on those 7 carries. Meanwhile, Joe Mixon had nearly 3 times as many carries with 20, and he was able to punch in 6 of his own. Joe Mixon has 16 or more touches inside the 5-yard line in each of the last 3 years. Now, as for what specifically to expect from Joe Mixon in 2024, right? He's the new RB1 for the Houston Texans. Last year's RB1 for the Houston Texans, which at some points was Dameon Pierce and other points was Devin Singletary, the RB1 for the Houston Texans had 15 or more touches in 12 of 20 games that the Houston Texans played last year. In fact, on average, the Texans' RB1 handled 18.1 touches per game last season. I'm projecting Joe Mixon for 15 to 19 touches per game as a Houston Texan. And in 32 career games where Joe Mixon has handled between 15 and 19 touches, he's averaged 13.5 PPR points. Now, candidly, that's not all that terrific. I was expecting a higher number when narrowing the window down to 15 to 19 touches. I was expecting a higher number than just 13.5 PPR points, but for context, averaging 13.5 PPR points over a 17-game season last year would make Joe Mixon an RB20 or RB13 in 2023. He's a solid high-end RB2 in 2024 fantasy football leagues who should offer the occasional RB1, if not top 10 week from time to time. So, are we smashing or passing on Joe Mixon at RB13 around pick 60 overall? This is the portion of the draft where wide receivers start to fall off a cliff and all of these solid running back options begin to appear. I am more than happy to smash Joe Mixon around pick 60 overall. In fact, Basement Brood Fantasy Football's draft guide actually has Joe Mixon ranked 54th overall. Last but not least, let's run through Dalton Schultz, who is entering his age 28 season and year 2 of the Bobby Slowick, CJ Stroud offense with the Houston Texans. Do we smash or pass on tight end 13 around pick 129 overall, which is a late 11th round pick? Now, year 1 was a success for Dalton Schultz with the Houston Texans. He averaged over 10 PPR points and nearly 6 targets per game. He finished as fantasy's number 10 tight end on the season, and he finished top 12 among tight ends in targets, catches, yards, and touchdowns. The guy scored 10 or more PPR points in 47% of his games, including 3 different games over 15, with a high of 29. Now, if you paid attention during Nico Collins, Stefon Diggs, and Tank Dell, then you already know where this story is going. You already know what the concern is for Dalton Schultz in 2024. There's just too many mouths to feed, and Dalton Schultz is more than likely going to be, at best, 4th in line for targets behind Stefon Diggs, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell, and that's not even mentioning Joe Mixon. Last year, in 9 fully healthy games with both Tank Dell and Nico Collins, Dalton Schultz averaged just 5.3 targets per game, a number that's likely to drop with the addition of Stefon Diggs. And Vegas sportsbooks are currently projecting Dalton Schultz for over or under 525.5 receiving yards, which would have finished 19th among all tight ends last year. In fantasy football, he's unlikely to be reliable on a consistent basis with so many other mouths to feed. He's a much better best ball bet as a tight end too than he is as a season-long pick because of that week-to-week consistency. I'm treating Dalton Schultz as a mid-range tight end 2 who should offer the occasional streamer appeal and have much, much bigger upside should anything happen to any of the Texans' first 3 wide receivers. But he is being drafted in a very competitive spot. He's being drafted near Trevor Lawrence, Jerry Jeudy, Austin Eckler, Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, Ezekiel Elliott, Josh Downs, Jahan Dotson, Gabe Davis, Justin Herbert, and several other guys. I am fine with smashing Dalton Schultz as your number 2 tight end in a best ball draft, but in a regular-sized, season-long redraft league, I am passing on Dalton Schultz in 2024 fantasy football. Basement Brood Fantasy Football's draft guide currently has Dalton Schultz ranked at 125 overall. That's all for today. Let me know in the comments below who you want me to cover in my next Smash or Pass episode of Inside the 20. Of course, BBFF Discord members do get first priority and first dibs on who we cover next. BBFF's online community and Discord server that's filled with sharp fantasy football brains and NFL fans that are dedicated to helping each other outsmart their friends, dominate their leagues, cash in on NFL bets, and take down DFS contests. You can join us while the cost is less than 1 beer per month using the link that we left for you in the show notes. I'll see you on the fantasy football field. Cheers. This brew's for you.